This week, Edwin Shuttleworth joins us from Finite State to talk about firmware analysis in his talk at the recent GRRCON Security Conference. Stay tuned. Below the Surface is coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 39, being recorded on Wednesday, October 2nd, 2024. Mr. Alan Alford is here with us in his recently renovated studio. I love it, dude. I love it. It's looking
Thank
great.
you, sir.
It's looking great.
Sounding good, too.
Yes, looking great, sounding great. It's fantastic. Before we jump into it, I want to remind our Below the Surface listeners where you can learn more about Eclipsium and visit eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. Edwin Shuttleworth is here with us from Finite State. Edwin, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell the listeners about where you work, what your title is, and all that stuff?
Yeah, happy to be here. I work at Finite State, which is IoT security, product security. Do a lot of SBOM, that kind of thing. It's one of those. It's really evolved since I joined.
Nice.
We've done a little bit of everything. We say firmware as well, but we have a little bit different definition of firmware than Eclipsium, I think.
Yeah, well, we'll dig into there's a lot of firmware is a loaded term, man. It means lots
really
of different
is.
things to lots of people. I completely agree. So Edwin, what's your role at Finite State?
So I've got my job title is senior security researcher. I do some security research these days. I'm doing a lot of services stuff as well, which has been an absolute blast. In the past, I've done support. I've done engineering work. I've been around the whole gamut, more or less, everything but front end at this point.
Nice, that's awesome. So how did you get into information security?
So it's kind of funny. It's just sort of the kind of thing I always just had a passive interest in since like middle school, high school. I used to watch a lot of DEF CON, Black Hat talks, usually while doing other stuff. But I never really took it too seriously as a thing to do, pretty much until I joined Finite State as an intern in 2018.
That's awesome. So you've been there for a while. Wow, that's great.
Oh yeah.
So what drew you into Finite State to work in firmware security?
It's a really funny story. So I went to college at OSU for data analytics originally. So I guess my whole path here, I started in high school doing robotics, mainly on the programming side, but just a little bit of everything there. Specifically FRC. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but fantastic program. Started out there. Data analytics, particularly machine learning, was starting to become a bit of a thing. Nowhere near as big as it is now, but I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I really like statistics. Started doing that. Went to college doing that, and at some point, I was looking for internships, and this at the time very small security company based in Columbus was looking for interns specifically to do firmware scraping. And because I'd spent a bunch of time doing data stuff, you got to gather data sets. I had some decent experience scraping websites. I came in, I started working, writing scrapers, and pretty quickly just thought it was absolutely fascinating and got stuck in with all kinds of other parts of the business, writing unpackers,
Edwin,
analysis.
Yeah. When you say scrapers, you mean like going to the internet and downloading firmware?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So you started doing that project in 2018.
Yep.
That's amazing. That's amazing because I shared with you the recent project that I embarked on, where it was based on the research that you included in your talk. from GRRCON. So
Yeah.
we'll get in. I guess we'll get into that. But Alan, you had a question about the GRRCON. I was at GRRCONs where I met Edwin through
nice.
our mutual
So,
friend Larry Pesh.
Okay, really 3 questions in one. The first one is, tell me all about GERCON. I want to hear. I have, believe it or not, I have never been to a GERCON yet. I want to hear your take on what that conference is, why that conference is so cool, but specifically, what was your talk and why did you give that talk?
So to start off from the beginning, this was also my first GRRCON.
Oh, nice.
I had never been there before. I'd never been through Grand Rapids before. When I drive through Michigan, it's usually to Detroit. I'm based in Chicago, so it's going to be to Detroit, and I skip below it because it's a little faster. Very, very cool place. I absolutely I like Michigan in general, but like very cool. It's very hilly compared to the rest of Michigan. As a conference, it was a blast. Significantly larger than I expected it to be. And everybody was really nice. Mark in particular, absolutely love Mark. Really nice. Huge vendor hall. That blew me away. Paul, you probably did not have as great a time there. I imagine it's a little bit trickier to attract people.
Dude, there was free beer in the sponsor area, and I got to talk with all my friends and meet new people. Dude, I had the best time, even though I had to work the booth, but I made the best of it, man. We were hacking M5 stack, ESP32 gear. It was great fun. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, the VIP area was incredible, right? I've worked volunteered at BlueSeamCon a few times, and there's like a lounge, like a speaker lounge, volunteer lounge, which it's fantastic if you need to sit down and work on your presentation, or if you just need to like decompress for a minute, or just eat lunch in peace. I expected the VIP lounge to be the same. It was not. It was awesome. Tons of snacks, tons of, like you said, free. They just loaded beer onto a cart and just wheeled it in. They had like masseuses there, which was cool as hell.
Oh my goodness.
It was wildly over the top in a very, very fun way.
Cool. So what was your talk? What did you talk about, and why did you talk about it?
So it was the name of which I kind of forget because it was not a great name. Especially after getting there, I was like, man, I really wish I had gotten a better one. But it was basically an intro to firmware reverse engineering from the perspective of not like a professional pen tester, but somebody who just wants to get started, ideally without spending any money. There's a couple reasons I kind of chose this and kind of put this together. Part of it was just this is because I'd spent so much time doing automated for reverse engineering. It really translates to that pretty well. But the other really big part of this is it's something that's weirdly not touched on that much. I am a huge fan of practical IoT hacking.
Nice.
Fantastic book.
That's a good one.
It is primarily focused though towards kind of that pen testing perspective, like dynamic analysis. Fantastic resource for that. However, if you like don't want to buy a device, or if you want to try to test something before you buy it, maybe, or if it's something that is either mission critical to you or just really expensive, my air conditioner is smart. My girlfriend's really cool. She's absolutely fantastic. I don't think she'd let me take it out of the window, crack it open, and start trying to pull firmware off of it. At least not until maybe a couple more months here, when it starts cooling down a little more here in Chicago. It's like there is this point where like you need to be able to do this. The alternative is like I buy another one. I'm not doing that. I'm like 40 pounds, something like that. So that's kind of the general thing. It's also just generally introductory talk, trying to get people interested, trying to get resources out there, because it is a really intimidating field to get into. There's not nearly as much documentation. That's kind of it.
Yeah, Edwin, I'm really fascinated with you 6 years ago started scraping the internet for firmware. My recent expedition in downloading firmware was based on some of the resources you put into your talk. Specifically, the team that came up with Checkup and released that firmware data set. It's public. It's on the internet. You can find it on GitHub. There's one CSV file with like 180,000+ lines of vendor product in a URL where you can download the firmware from. There is an additional CSV file that contains a list of FTP servers. They did not provide very great examples of code, likely on purpose. I will say, if you're interested and you know how to prompt an LLM, you can pretty easily get it to generate Python scripts that will do what you want them to do with those scripts, and it's a fun exercise. Make sure you have a lot of disk space. But I'm curious, Edwin, what's your experience with scraping firmware and your impression of the firmware data set that was published not that long ago?
So my thoughts, like historically, scraping firmware, I really enjoy it. It's kind of weird if like writing scrapers is kind of considered a intern grade task. I've always found it really fun and gratifying, though, for some reason. I don't know, like a pack rat kind of mentality, you know?
Yeah. I want to go scrape,
But
save all the things, right? Yeah.
get it all, get it on the NAS, saved away for later. Figure out what I'm going to do with it later, but for now, just keep it. It's I think it's harder now in a lot of ways because like firmware over the air has evolved and is actually used a lot more. People kind of acknowledge that if you just give customers like, hey, don't worry, you can update your firmware by going to our website and select the exact product you have, and then take a USB stick and you take it and you put it on there and then you plug it into the device, and like nobody does that. Nobody wants to do that. And so we've moved to firmware over the air as an industry as a much better way of doing things.
Oh, right. So the device just goes and gets the new firmware for you and saves you the step having to go to the vendor's website, download it, and install it on the device.
Yep.
Right.
And there's 2 chips in the device, one for the one they've downloaded, one for the recovery back to factory, et cetera, et cetera. Little
maybe
protection in case the device gets dumb about it, right?
Maybe not in consumer IoT devices, but certainly other ones.
Right.
It depends.
Yeah.
That is definitely the correct way to do it. Helps a lot when you to not brick your device on updates, which everybody wants that. From an overall perspective with that data set, I haven't really investigated it too much. I need to. One day I'd love to pull it down and process it. It's so large. I think it was 16 terabytes in total.
Yeah,
of which
I think that's unpacked. So I downloaded roughly 185,000 firmware samples, and it took up about 3 terabytes, maybe. I ran through the FTP list. I think by that time I was up to 3.6. I took another suggestion from your talk, so make sure you go check out Edwin's talk. I know you're working on posting that to your social media.
Now.
It is posted.
It's on LinkedIn at least.
Awesome.
And my GitHub.
There was another one, an older project from Firmadyne that had a scraper that I didn't realize that I learned from you, Edwin. So thank you for that. And it had been updated fairly recently. And I ran through that, and I think I'm just over 4.1 terabytes of compressed firmware. I think the 16 terabyte is if you start unpacking that firmware, which is kind of where I go next. But I bought a 20 terabyte USB drive on sale. And I was like, I'll just use this for now, right? So you don't start eating up your hard drive space. That's my advice. I don't know what your advice is. You've collected a lot of firmware over the years, so I'm sure you
do that.
More
Get a NAS at some point. It's a fun project just in general, building a NAS, but absolutely. I need to look up the exact numbers that they published. The upshot is that they did not even process all of it, if I recall correctly.
Yes, that's
correct. So, like, it is an incredible amount of firmware to work with in general. I forget the points leading into this. One thing to note about it, which I think is interesting, is I don't. It's a weird data set, and I don't think it's really that. It's not that diverse. I don't think it's representative of the.
I agree.
The overall market, which is always a really hairy thing to say. Like, what does it even mean for it to be representative of the market?
My assessment of that, Edwin, to your point, I'll back up your point with some data. When I looked at the data that I have, there's a large number of DDWRT and OpenWRT firmware that's on there because it's easily downloadable, and they download every single version of it. And I think just those two combined is several hundred gigabytes. Why when they analyzed it, it was largely, so they analyzed the firmware as to what platform and what CPU architecture. I think you had that in your slides as well, Edwin, right?
Oh yeah.
It was largely Linux on MIPS. And I'm like, but if you include DDWare and OpenWare, mostly that's Linux firmware running on MIPS. So
yeah, OpenWRT alone, I've probably downloaded a couple of terabytes over the years myself. I mean, I've been using that since way back.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But even like along the edges of that, right? There were a couple other obscure architectures, relatively obscure architectures that were wildly overrepresented. Blackfin, for instance, I believe was one of them.
Yes.
Like that's not terribly common, but it made I think it was 8% of the data set, which is a lot. Really cool, fantastic to have it. But like with ARM at like 13, something's imbalanced here. That's not necessarily an issue. It all just depends on what conclusions you draw from this data set, right? My stats nerd coming out here.
No, it's a great point. Also, how do we validate the firmware? Because I know some of the firmware that I got came from like super sketchy, weird FTP sites, and I was like, what if that's not really the firmware I'm expecting? So I'm assuming you've still got to do some validation of this, right?
It depends what you want to do. Definitely validate if you're going to actually flash it. I've found various firmwares on various strange places. Russian forums are my favorite.
Yep.
I would not recommend running that necessarily, unless you have a way to validate it. It's a big problem of how do you validate an update with like everybody's always talking about supply chain attacks for good reason. And I don't know if there's not really a great solution other than, I mean, ideally if it's signed, there you go, right?
Or even if it has a hash, maybe you compare it to the hash, but that's not foolproof necessarily, right? But
exactly,
it's a good measure, but certainly not perfect.
Well, I've told the tale on this show more than once now. I went and grabbed for my main gaming rig, just updating the BIOS on the motherboard on the gaming rig, and thought I was at the real site. I ran a clip simulator, and it told me, "No, dude, that's not a real BIOS."
Yeah,
so I was like, "Oh, thank you, Eclipsium." Yeah, I don't know how I got to where I got to. It looked authentic because half these sites are Taiwanese anyway. You expect a little broken English, you expect a little bit of a janky UX, and it was all those things I was expecting. And no, it was not the real site. And yes, it was modified.
Yep. I'm out of curiosity. Do you know if it was modified in a malicious way, or was this one of the gaming Russian modified ones to enable some features?
I think this one was a performance hack. Because I've got enough other stuff on the network to try to find the bad things going on.
Home.
I didn't see any comms back to the mothership. I didn't, there was no C2. There was no. I didn't detect any of that kind of nonsense. But I definitely was not running the BIOS I thought I was running. Full stop.
That's kind of scary. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around trying to do this right. I know that there was a discussion a while ago of trying to get some central repository for firmware hashes to try to maintain this in some way that could be done. I think right now there's not a solution. If you're looking at analysis, then maybe this doesn't quite matter as much, right? Again, you need to appropriately source it. Say, hey, I got this from what I believe is an integrator website. I don't know for sure, but it definitely wasn't the OEM. But I think it's probably valid. And if there's badness in there, then you need to probably go talk to you're going to report it, you got to talk to the OEM and say, hey, is this thing I got, is this even yours?
Yeah, or where in the supply, if it is backdoored in some way, where in the supply chain was it backdoored? I know there's still some debate and uncertainty with Android TV boxes and those coming with malware. And we still don't know to this day where that badness is coming from, where in the supply chain that's being introduced.
You're making the mistake of assuming that it's only one place that's introducing badness.
This is true. Yeah, right. If you're smart, you have multiple ways to make sure that it gets in there. Yeah, or there could be multiple backdoors in that Android TV format. That would not surprise me in the least, Edwin. It's accessible.
Yeah, like those set-top boxes and that kind of thing. Those really sketchy ones. Like you've got the manufacturer putting a backdoor in place for debugging purposes, and they pass that down to another integrator, and that person's putting a backdoor in for the purpose of making sure that you use their store page, or the store page is someone who sponsored them, and they're passing it to another person who's white labeling it, and they're putting on some ad spoofing adware on there to get clicks.
Yep.
And then they're finally passing it to somebody, and you're buying it.
Yeah.
That whole ecosystem is a mess. I really should spend some time trying to get as many of those images as possible and see if I can find them, because that'd be a fun project.
What do they say? It's a wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to turn to we've talked about acquiring firmware in some of the ways to do that, but once you get it, then you have to unpack it, and it's not, as Edwin and Alan, you guys know, right? It's not always straightforward. When we get to just the first phase of, I got this firmware, now I have to unpack it in some way. My specific question to you, skipping over a lot of introductory material for our audience, I apologize, but there's Unblob, there's now the old BinWalk, and now there's the new Rust version of BinWalk. Edwin, have you tested those three tools, and what's your kind of impression in comparing all three of those?
I've tested them to some degree. BinWalk, old BinWalk specifically, V2, is my beloved. I love BinWalk. There are so many advantages with it. The big one with it is that you don't need dependencies until you actually need them. So the way, just to quickly overview generic carvers, they have a bunch of signatures that they're searching for. They find the signatures in a file, and then they try to find the length of that subfile, extract it, and then they'll run an extractor against that if needed, right? So if you have like a JFFS2 file system, it will use Jefferson as the unpacker for that. BinWalk doesn't require you to install any of those unpackers to use out of the box. So if you have problems installing Jefferson or whatever,
which if you try to install Jefferson, you will have problems installing Jefferson.
It's the reason I'm picking on Jefferson.
It's a great example.
Like if you don't run into JFFS2, it just doesn't matter. You don't need to install Jefferson. It'll all work.
You're fine.
Unblob is not that way. It has something like 30 dependencies, and they need to be installed for it to work.
Right. Or I like Unblob. Unblob has a container that I really like. That they built in all the right. I was like, oh, that's just beautiful.
It's significantly heavier weight. It extracts more stuff. It doesn't have as many signatures though.
Interesting.
Which may or may not be an issue for you.
Yeah.
Unblob, I think, is they're both great options. In my opinion, I like using BinWalk. It's the one I'm a little more comfortable with. If I run into trouble, then Unblob is just the next tool to pick up. Now, Unblob. So historically, BinWalk, Reform Labs was purchased by Microsoft. At which point, development kind of stopped for a long time. It was actually last Sunday that they released the new one.
I saw it in your talk. You had like the strike through in your talk because you had to update it at the 11th hour, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I was sitting there, I was going to go up and say, all right, well, I love BinWalk. Like I hadn't updated, it was OSPG or something like that. Another company had taken it and actually gone ahead and forked it and started updating it a little bit.
I said that on previous podcasts, right? The version of BinWalk you have in your Linux distro is probably not the BinWalk from the Reform Labs repo. It's from another forked repo that was maintaining BinWalk that hopefully we all know and love and trust. But who knows?
But yeah, on Sunday it was announced there's a new BinWalk. It's rewritten in Rust. Right now, it is significantly worse than old BinWalk and Unblob. However, active development, all that.
And that has to be Craig Hefner that did the rewrite.
I believe so. Yeah, I'm 95% sure.
Okay.
It's very cool, very fast. Of course, like I said, it's not up to par, but it's currently released as unstable experimental. So
right.
Yeah, what do you expect?
I will definitely
move to it.
Yeah, you lose capability at first. You gain speed, you lose breadth, right? And eventually you get your breadth back, and now you have speed in. It'll take a while.
Yep. I'm hoping that Rust BinWalk is going to be the tool I can just go with. I can stop playing with Unblob. But in the meantime, Unblob and BinWalk are two fantastic unpackers that's going to be useful for the foreseeable future.
Sweet. There's some slides in your talk where you're defining kind of the IoT landscape, and Alan, you had a question along those lines.
Yeah, and we've already kind of hinted at it and teased it a little bit, but IoT, I think most people think of IoT and they think of maybe, like you said, smart air conditioner, smart refrigerator, my
Smart trash
WAP,
cans. By the way, my wife went to go buy
Yeah.
a trash can, and she's like, there's smart. I mean, can you buy one so I can reverse engineer it? 'Cause that'd be
smart
awesome.
trash cans. Okay. Smart toothbrushes, smart washers and dryers, smart whatever the crap around the house. The point is IoT equals crap around the house, right? And obviously there's more to IoT than that. But without getting into OT, where is the commercial? What kind of IoT are you seeing out there that's viable and useful in the corporate world, but isn't necessarily OT?
That's a great question. I definitely have a little bit of a rant on this because like there's a lot of people who, that when they talk about IoT, they look at it as being these like solutions looking for a problem for the consumer, right? The smart trash can, your smart like egg tray.
Oh my goodness. They have those?
Oh yeah, they do. Yeah, smart egg trays. I was talking to my buddies like, well, you got to put the smart water bottle in there, right? Like the water bottle that tells you how much you drank. Super important stuff. Very, very helpful for daily life. But the reality is like, well, first off, when I stop calling it IoT and I start calling it embedded, suddenly the discussion changes, right?
Yeah.
When it's your modem and not your egg tray, that's a problem. They're both running Linux, maybe. When I'm talking about security cameras, when we're talking about access points, all this traditional IT infrastructure, that's kind of all IoT already. Or if it's not, it's like it's similar enough. And then on top of that, again, before we start talking about OT or like medical devices, when you talk about businesses, you really get value from stuff that you might not get as an individual, right? A smart trash can probably is not useful to you. I know how full my trash can is because I took it out this morning. If I have a fleet of 50 trash cans, having telemetry on them could actually come in handy.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The use case is different. I snickered at the smart trash can, but let's say you have a campus like Google's campus, just as a random, completely random example, right? They have a massive campus. They probably have maybe thousands of trash cans, right? Smart trash cans could actually help them solve any challenges they have with that.
This still doesn't explain the egg tray, but let's keep going.
Okay, let's do the egg tray then, right? I'm McDonald's. I have like fleets of eggs that come in. Now they probably solve this in a different way, which is totally acceptable. But let's say I have like a fleet of eggs. I go through, I don't know, like a couple hundred eggs a day. I have smart things. When they get loaded in, we check them in. And then I can say I have eggs that are too old to be used currently, or the use of eggs has increased. They solve this in a different way though. So that's not the best example. Another one would be like the thermometer, fish tank thermometers.
Mm-hmm.
There was a certain casino with a big fish tank that was hacked through the fish tank thermometer. That seems weird until you consider, hey, that fish tank and all the fish in it costs a ton of money, and having telemetry on how are the fish doing is probably really, really important to them. Even if
there's this weird niche that's hard to, it's almost difficult to define because we have these terms like IoT and firmware that are very overloaded. And I feel like now that I hear you guys talk that we need some type of framework, common language to work off of, because I've heard it termed as enterprise IoT. I've heard it termed as industrial IoT, and but you also have network appliances, like you mentioned, access points, router switches, for example. That's also kind of like it is an embedded system. Is it IoT? Maybe it depends. It would be nice to define a common language and framework where we can categorize these things and do better tracking of them in our various environments and in the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I grew up on embedded systems that were video conferencing, right? Like we didn't think of that as IoT, but it was embedded. It was a unit.
Sure.
There were dozens of them around the building. There were, that was effectively IoT. I get that argument.
Yeah, it's a device that was never meant to be remoted into. Right? It's not a desktop where you have a keyboard. It's not a laptop where you got a keyboard and you got a screen. It's not a server where you SSH in. You're never, ever supposed to be logging in. It's supposed to be just doing one specific job. What is that?
Yeah, but you talk about it in your talk, Edwin, too, to segue to the other term that I think also is overloaded and we're struggling with, and that's firmware.
Yeah.
And largely, like the context that we talked about in the beginning of the show was I downloaded firmware from the internet and I unpacked firmware. And largely, we're talking about Linux-based firmware. That the way I would define that is, it is a firmware image that contains usually the bootloader, the kernel, and file systems, right? And that all comes as one package that we call firmware. But you expand in your talk to there's other different types of firmware that I think we also need to include in this framework that we're going to apparently assign ourselves and work together on or something. We need the standard language, right? To define firmware, not just the devices, but also the types of firmware. So what is the types of firmware that you talked about in your talk? I think it's good to review with our listeners.
Yeah, so in the talk, I started with Linux. That requires the least explanation, Android, all that kind of good stuff. Then I have RTOS, which is real-time operating systems. These are they have an operating system. They have all that layers of.
In RTOS is by operating system. You mean it has a kernel, right?
Yeah, PSOS, Wind River.
Yeah.
Yep. Wind River, FreeRTOS, which is the Amazon one, Microsoft's, formerly Microsoft's one, ThreadX, which is now under Eclipse. Those all offer a lot of benefits compared to fully featured operating systems like Linux, which are mainly important in like safety critical systems. You can have like guarantees around speed and stuff like that.
But guarantees around speed for a very particular use case is how I think of right. And also the Linux kernel has also real-time kernels that are trying to catch up, I think, right, to the ones that are sheer RTOS.
There's a whole other discussion about how many OSs are there really in like just in a normal Linux install, because there's quite a few when you start counting drivers.
Right. And firmware.
Oh yeah. And you really start talking about firmware, that gets pretty crazy. There's all the real-time operating systems, and then we also have bare metal, which is just it's like Arduino's one big C file that you flash on.
I use the general term microcode to define those, and I describe it as it's really just code running on a chip. There's no operating system, there's no kernel, right? That's the big differentiator for me.
And for me, FPGA deserves a call out in its own realm within that microcode category, right? Because it's Lego brick code. It's layered from God only knows how many different sources. It's not, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think microcode, I think somebody injected one unit of code into one chip, and then FPGA, I think 15, 20, 30 units of code injected into a chip from all these different sources, and it's a little different.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the different devices that run this firmware, are we missing anything? There are other categories of firmware. Those are the like three major categories for me, right? There's like Linux-based that has a kernel. There's a real-time operating systems, and then there's microcode that runs directly on the chip. I think those are the three major classes, right? That when we say firmware, it could mean any of those things.
Oh yeah, I think there's also been some like academic research trying to categorize like this section of the firmware discussion. Which I don't know how many or any of it has stuck. There was one horrible one where they're trying to like class it as like type 1, type 2, type 3.
Yeah.
Which I think is absurd way of defining things. But I think that's typically how things are broken up. And I think FPGAs are usually considered another category entirely, but rolling them into bare metal would also make sense in a lot of cases.
It's interesting to think about in UEFI. And we've had this discussion. Right now there is no definitive answer, but is it an operating system? Or is it, we call it UEFI, we call it firmware, right? I'm going to upgrade the firmware on my computer. I'm going to upgrade the UEFI firmware. We use the term firmware, but where does it fall in the three categories we defined? I think it has bits and pieces from all three. It's kind of a strange beast.
It definitely is.
There's no kernel. I mean, I think it's one thing we can agree on when we talk about it internally, right? There is no kernel. So there's that.
Yeah, I do not have a lot to contribute to that one. I really don't know where you put that.
Yeah. It's a category in and of itself, I think, for now.
Yeah, most likely. It's really something that needs to be handled, I think, separately, for the most part, because it is. You could also consider it like a part of, the rest of the whole firmware system, right? Like you have a bootloader inside of like a Linux install. Do you just say like, well, UEFI just belongs with the Linux or the Windows like total system?
Yeah, that's the
really
other
don't
debate
know.
we have.
Right.
Is a bootloader part of the operating system, or is it more a part of UEFI because it'll live on the EFI partition and is written to a certain standard that's not the operating system? So we have that debate as well.
But it's got disk access, and therefore it's got drivers, and therefore it's, I mean, it's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Where's a Federalist biped sitting here too? where do we put any of this stuff?
Right.
At some point, I don't know. I try to stay out of these discussions mainly because I had a lot of linguistics classes in college, which just kind of made me just step away. But I don't really care. Whatever everybody uses is just the term that we should use. But that's obviously quite controversial.
What type of firmware, Edwin, are you primarily working with? Is it the Linux-based firmware primarily?
Linux and RTOS, mainly Linux. That's
gotcha.
It's the one that's also the most complex and has the most stuff that can go wrong in a lot of cases. And it's also the most fixable. And so from that perspective, it's definitely the most viewed. It's also, we do a lot of SBOMs. It's the hardest to get an SBOM for.
Yeah.
Like, by far.
For sure. Because you also think about there are, more often than not, both proprietary and open source components in a lot of the firmware, right? Because the hardware is going to dictate, well, you use this particular piece of hardware, and by the way, the drivers for that are not open source, and that just leads to all kinds of debacles.
Yep. Well, pretty common case, I kind of talked a little bit when I was joking about set-top boxes, but like it's not uncommon for one manufacturer to really not be rolling everything from scratch. Like they have their suppliers, and their suppliers are giving them a base image,
right?
And they don't know what's in that base image.
Yeah, they're not checking it. That's part of the problem. And a lot of these verticals, they're doing zero checking. In Android, set-top boxes are definitely one of those.
And this is where that daisy chain of bad things you described comes from, right? Is, I mean, you get lazy, right? I'm sourcing chips from the Philippines, and they cost 0.5 cents cheaper a chip than the ones from Mexico. I'm going to switch if the Philippine chips happen to have the same functionality I want. Am I really going to question that? Am I going to dig in deeper, or am I going to let that backdoor into my products? I mean,
well, but you fill out a vendor survey. You asked, do you have any backdoors in your chip? And they said not
no.
that I know of.
Yeah.
Right. We asked them.
Any security issues
here? Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Yeah. Piece of paper.
Edwin, when we move beyond, so change gears slightly. So we talked about unpacking. We talked about mounting file systems. I want to talk. What's your impression of Emba and some of the automated framework tools that are in that same category? You mentioned some in your talk, Firmidine being one of the other ones.
Emba is really cool. I think Emba is awesome. Emba does not go. It's definitely really wide. I don't know how deep it goes all the time.
Yeah, agreed.
I've definitely seen some plenty situations where it's not so good. Emba, by the way, like you're saying, it's like a full pipeline for unpacking and doing some analysis. It's got some configuration analysis. It's got a little bit of SBOM, software component analysis in there. Yep. It tries to match up with CVEs. And it's even using FirmAE, doing a little emulation as well, optionally.
Yeah.
Which, super cool. Great place to get started. I don't think it's enough for, definitely not enough for an enterprise, and really probably not enough to sate your curiosity as an individual either.
Yeah, it's like a good starting point. Like I find if you're looking at firmware, you run it through Emba, and that's kind of like your baseline, which is what I believe the developers intended. They did an interview with the and other podcasts, Floss Weekly. And so, guys, if you're listening, I listened, and I'm going to try and bring you on this show as well, because I love the Emma team. They're great people. And just there's like an awesome series of bash scripts that, like, remember I don't know if you remember the sticker that says, "I'll replace you with a small shell script." Like, they replaced a lot of the manual work I was doing for firmware with basically a whole set of shell scripts, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, it's a really cool project. The bash is horrifying to me. That's like not
It can't
okay.
be. If you don't live in that world, certainly. I've taken a look at it, and I'm like, yeah, but in a large scale, that's kind of what bash looks like, right? Like, that's use what language you're comfortable in, right? So
totally. That's my biggest criticism of that project. Oh my god, the bash.
Yes.
But,
yeah.
But overall, like, it's super cool. I love Emba. Like, it's a really cool project, especially for like enterprises. Check it out, but it's probably not going to be what you need, and you're probably gonna need a lot more than what it's gonna give you. But it's a fantastic start, like you said.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the automation, because it, like I said, it can save you time. I think one of the things it does, actually, I know one of the things it does is, if there is a known way to decrypt the firmware, it will just go ahead and decrypt that for you and save you the time of going, it's encrypted. Like, let me go dig on the internet and figure out someone else has already, like, done some work to be able to decrypt this firmware and then make it work on my machine. Like, they've done a great job doing that. So
it's the old DJI key leak. Just,
yep.
Does this apply? Cool. Just
do it. But some of the things it does is emulation in different forms. I think it will run individual binaries, right, in QEMU, and emulate the architecture to get a version string back for it. I mean, that's just great automation to have. But if you're going to emulate a full firmware distribution, Edwin, it's still a huge lift, right? We don't have any great solutions around, and I'm sure you've done it too. Like, it is a lot of work. I mean, I've talked to the project leader, Samil, is it Samil that does the ARMX? I think he renamed it. It's one of the emulation frameworks. I'm getting the name wrong. I think his first name is Samil, and he said that if you're trying to get a piece of firmware, like we're talking about Linux-based firmware for something like an ARM or MIPS platform, it can take weeks to months to be able to emulate that correctly. And currently, I don't know of great ways for shortcuts. I mean, short of maybe you're starting to train some LLMs to help you with that, but I don't think we're quite there yet. What's your take on firmware emulation?
I don't do a huge amount of it. What I do, what I have, and when I do set stuff up, it's pretty much exclusively using FirmAE. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yep.
Little context. So Firmidine, there's a team that did, academic team that made a whole emulation system, specifically mainly for like routers and that kind of category of product.
Yeah, like they had a sample in there of like a Netgear router, and that totally works to emulate that. But if you want to customize it to emulate anything else, like, buckle up.
It gets heavy. Yeah. FirmAE was a development on that where they introduced a bunch of what they call arbitrations to try to get it more automated.
Yeah, sure.
It's just something where like it either works or it mostly works, and you got to keep digging into it, or like you could be in for a lot of playing with it to get it to work correctly. It all depends on like how much peripheral devices it needs, how well how well it handles not having those peripheral devices, how correctly formatted it is when it starts. One big tip: if you pulled it off of a live box, like a live the image off of a live device, check for lock files and like cruft that gets created or is assumed to not be there. Which is maybe a little bit intuitive. Like, you imagine, like, oh, I need to make sure that this stuff, all the things that are there. Sometimes the inverse is true.
And I get concerned, like, looking for vulnerabilities in live systems versus emulated systems. And I've seen research actually that pointed out that, well, this vulnerability was disclosed in an emulated version of it, but when it actually runs on the live device, you can't access that. That vulnerability is no longer in play. I can't recall the specific instance, but you've seen stuff like that too, right? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So I think this is true, definitely true in reverse engineering, definitely true in security in general, probably just true in general. Like, you got to keep your head up, keep your head on a swivel, keep your like awareness of what is going on, what am I doing, why do I believe the things I believe, what am I actually, what is actually happening here, right? When you are testing on an emulator and something crashes, something doesn't work, are you testing the product or are you testing the emulator?
Right.
Does it generalize? This is true I think this is true just in general of life, right? Like, you got to check, like, why do I believe the things I believe? Like, am I testing something that's not actually representative? Frequently, you have to test against the model rather than in real life, and this is one of those cases. But yeah, like, it can be a big problem if you're working on like web bugs. The web bugs are a great thing to test on an emulator. Kernel stuff, not so much.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
What is
unless you're like Unicorn or something.
What's your approach to testing the web interface? Because we interviewed Matt Brown previously on the show, and we all agreed that oftentimes a lot of the vulnerabilities under the covers aren't reachable necessarily, but the web interface is like that main contact point. And so if you can find a vulnerability in the web interface, that may give you enough access, or at least access to all those other underlying vulnerabilities. So Edwin, what's your approach to testing these web frameworks that I find greatly vary across all of these devices? Some are Java, some are PHP. It's like, it's all over the map. Some are both, right?
Yeah, I don't have a single like playbook. Realistically, it's going to be just a lot of the same like web app pen testing skills that you're going to be looking at for, across the board. At the end of the day, it's a web app running on a server. Not that different if it's a server that's on a little tiny dinky D-Link router, or if it's a server on a Google cloud instance somewhere. So a lot of the same stuff. Do all your same like recon, gather as much information as you can. Start fuzzing out every instance of user input as you can get before you start doing auth, after you do auth, command injection, all that kind of stuff. Command injection is one I see a lot. A lot of these devices are either very old or written by people who are not terribly security conscious or trying to hit a budget, don't have time, and you can usually get pretty far through a web app.
Yeah, oftentimes if I'm looking to like make a shortcut and I unpack the firmware and I go start poking around at the web application code, I get lost really quickly because that's the raw firmware image. And during the installation of that firmware image, it will do some kind of configuration and unpacking and put things in all the symlinks are broken. But when it's on the actual device, all that stuff is sorted out. So sometimes going backwards is a lot of work. But when you would think, oh, I can just look at the web app source code, it's not that simple, right?
Yeah. And we're back to the log files and that kind of thing too, right? Like that's part of this.
Totally. Or there might be configuration files that get generated dynamically.
Right.
A lot of the stuff, especially now, you really want to be pulling data from NVRAM instead of hard-coded stuff, on the device or on the image or on the update. NVRAM is going back a little bit to the emulation stuff as well. NVRAM is a big problem for emulation. You really got to start, in a lot of cases, looking at reverse engineering, update, setup, or service binaries to try to see what exactly it's looking for in those places.
Yeah, and then you have to emulate NVRAM. And I want to say I've read some articles in the past year or two where they made modifications to Firmidine, or they merged in another project into Firmidine to do better emulation of NVRAM. And so you're going to run into that problem too.
FirmAE does it better.
Okay, so FirmAE has an NVRAM emulator built in.
Yeah, well, Firmidine does too, but
it's not that great.
It was pretty simple.
Firmidine's an older project, right? That was based on older research.
It was, to be clear, like, we're picking on Firmidine a little bit here. It's like 8 years old now. It was cutting edge for sure at the time.
Oh, yeah.
It's still a pretty cool project. But they made decisions that, like, in retrospect, we now know are better. if I remember correctly, like the default for 9 is if it doesn't know an NVRAM value, it just passes a null in.
Mm-hmm.
We found out that leads to a lot of null dereferences. And so I believe firmAE does an empty string.
Mm-hmm.
And like that alone makes a big difference in a lot of cases.
Sure.
Right, because again, are you debugging the app or are you debugging the emulation of the app?
Yeah, exactly.
Edwin, for those that want to start getting into looking at firmware, right? They've heard us talk about how projects that exist publicly on GitHub that you can acquire firmware. They want to start analyzing it. Like, what advice do you have for them? What resources are out there that can help them with this process?
That is a great question. I actually got a very similar question to talk, and that was probably my favorite one. The number one thing is like start with stuff that you think is interesting, not necessarily stuff that you think is going to be like an easy target to reverse engineer. Obviously, if you get into it and you're like, this is horrible, this is like encrypted, or it's like an RTOS and you're not comfortable with Ghidra, look something else. But the first one is definitely like motivation wise, like find something you think is interesting to begin. For resources and stuff, there's a lot of great resources. Actually, not to plug the talk too much, but I have a ton linked through there for all kinds of different unpackers. And then overall, like, there's like a decent amount of resources. Obviously, grabbing it again, Practical IoT Hacking, fantastic book, absolutely love it. Outlines a lot of the stuff, especially more towards dynamic analysis. And then generally, there's just so many blog posts that people have made, usually with specific instances of hacking routers or weird little devices that are a great reference.
I agree. I have like a catalog of firmware reverse engineering, IoT reverse engineering posts, because it might not be the specific device that I'm going after, but they're doing something that is probably pretty close to what I need to do for this other thing. And I like to have that arsenal of these like little tips and tricks. It would be amazing if someone put together a more cohesive course. I used to actually back in the day teach a course on like intro to firmware reverse engineering.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That reminds me, one other tip that I really like, kind of related to the whole, like, keep your head up and looking around. So you have a device, especially if it's something cheap from Amazon, good chance it's a white label to some degree. Or even if it's not, good chance that, again, there is that base image that they're getting from somebody else. See, who makes, cool, okay, so I know this is, a XYZ product, but is that chip made by like ABC company? What else does ABC go into? Is there research already on that?
Yeah. Matt Brown was talking about that with the scales. He was evaluating IoT smart scales. And he was like, these two devices, while they're white labels completely different, under the covers, they're like 98% the same device.
Yeah.
It's super common. Also, he's a great dude.
Yeah.
He's got some great resources.
Yeah, that's probably, in terms of research, you just go watch all Matt's videos is a great starting point.
There you
right?
go.
Yeah,
there you go.
Step one. I got a bunch queued up I need to finish. That smart scale one.
Yeah.
But identify who the real players are. Especially when you're talking about, those kind of white labeled stuff. It's frequently just something you can find a lot of information on, as long as you're not looking for that obscure single brand.
Well, and there's even totally disparate products that you'll get under the hood and discover, oh, you guys are both running the same front end web chip, that like one's video conferencing and one's a router or something, Yep. You'll see some crazy overlap across types of IoT products too.
Oh, totally. Yeah. A lot of companies, license things or, reuse stuff. Like, you might as well, right? If you're already very familiar in using this one particular device, and you can just churn something out, like for COVID, for instance, everybody's trying to suddenly go make a bunch of video conferencing stuff. They're going to be more interested in reusing what they got right now to get a product to market now, rather than being, maximally efficient and choosing exactly the correct tool for the job.
And sometimes it's as simple as a sole engineer, right? Like I used to be an engineer, putting code into chips for this kind of company. Now I'm at this kind of company. I brought my code with me, and I'll bet I can make it work for 30% of what we're doing over here, and off they go to the races.
Yep.
They used to happen
Absolutely.
a lot with web management interfaces.
Yes.
They would just license those. I traced it back. Well, it's my favorite IoT device vulnerability is still Joel's backdoor. That's the one on a D-Link router where if you set your user agent string to Joel's backdoor spelled backwards, it would give you full access to the device. It's just awesome.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Joel.
And I traced it back to this company in Taiwan that made that was looked like they were the developers of that web interface. And this goes back to your, you mentioned SBOMs, Edwin. Kind of goes back to that. Like, how do we got to get an SBOM that can identify not just open source components, because those are easier, the commercial ones that may have been slightly tweaked, but is the same one and it could contain the same vulnerability. That's where we need to get really much better, in my opinion, across the board, not just with IoT, but I see this in UEFI as well. Like, where does a vulnerability stem from originally, and has it been preserved when it goes through the supply chain for different products, right?
Yep.
I think that's where we're at.
It's funny, we're doing this outside of the chips pretty well. You go look at a tool like Black Duck, and what is Black Duck saying? I'm going to look for a known package, library, module,
right,
etc. But Black Duck can also go through and say, you copied 10 lines of code
from this
module into your code, and I was smart enough to track its source back to that module, and you've inherited the defect as a result. Like, we're doing that with on software. Top of the OS development. Why aren't we doing it with below the OS development? It's the same thing.
Right.
There's some scary stuff with, well, I guess I'll do two here first. So there's first some scary stuff with Stack Overflow answers that are just subtly wrong.
Yeah.
There's usually not in security critical ways, but like it's not uncommon for some of the old answers to, like, very, very well viewed answers to be just wrong in some way. You have an edge case where they break, or have more configuration necessarily that you really want.
And now the LLMs have sucked in all that generally crappy. I mean, it's not necessarily really, a lot of it's not really crappy, but it's mediocre code. And when the LLMs write code, they tend to write back that mediocre code. And by mediocre, I'll give you a quick example. It's duplicating functionality in two different functions. And I'm like, it's not efficient, right? Because it's basing it on a code base that's not necessarily from senior developers that are making really efficient code.
Or context lists. This was a discussion I had with somebody recently about writing Terraform with LLMs, where you type in, I want you to do X, Y, Z, and it gives you Terraform, but it doesn't give you the minimal set of Terraform that you asked for. It might throw some extra configuration in there.
Yeah.
And is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing? It doesn't know, because it doesn't know your environment. It doesn't know your needs. But it gave you something, and it sourced that from somewhere where it was presumably necessary.
Yep.
That's a scary thing if you want to start generating Terraform that way.
It ties into that NVRAM conversation, and it makes me think of the video game emulator space, right? Which I think is a neat summary of both of those conversations, because you write your emulator with what you think your puts and gets are, and you start with that one game, and it works. And then you grab another game, and it suddenly quits working, and you realize, oh, I've got different puts and gets. And you tweak it again, and you add to the, and slowly your code base is growing, and slowly you're adding more and more games. And there's always that one game that just simply won't run because of whatever freaky tweaky thing it was doing. It's that same story, right? And to say that the early stage code is bad code, that's not fair. It's just, it's not going to work everywhere, or this one thing might break it, or whatever the story is.
So, Edwin, I just want to, congratulations on your first conference talk. And I believe this is also your first podcast interview as well.
It is, yeah.
So you're knocking it out of the park in first, man. Like, congrats for that.
It's this week.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks for coming on the show and talking with us. And I want to point everyone to your LinkedIn. If you go to Edwin's LinkedIn page, you can find the slides that we're talking about. I don't know if they'll post the videos from GRRCON. Do you know if they do? They don't.
There's no recordings.
Yeah. So you'll have to get Edwin's slide and then listen to this podcast, and get you most of the way there. So Edwin and Ken, thanks for coming on Below the Surface.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been fantastic.
With that, that will conclude the show. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.